Thank you for coming back to join us for part 3. If you've been with us all along, we have been on a journey through the child feedback process. And so this workshop series, if you're just joining us, this is, as I said, session 3. Session number 1 was strategies for child feedback. Session number 2 last week, we talked about empowering the elementary school contingent with the brain building book. And then today we're going to be diving deeper into the specific language that we can use to build a truly child-friendly diagnosis. So all the recordings and slides are available at brainbuildingbook.com/webinars. And I have Dr. Leanne Wumar and Kelsey Crowley, who are here helping me out today. They are the brain building team, and they're going to be throwing links into the chat for you as I mention different things. They are also here to answer any questions. So if you have any technical questions during the workshop, please feel free to message them directly. If you have general questions that you'd like me to answer, throw them in the chat and they'll be monitoring that so that I can answer those at the end. This workshop and the video will be up on brainbuildingbook.com hopefully this weekend, and I'll let everybody know when that happens. So we're just to remind you kind of where we've been and where we are in this process. We've talked about the keys to effective feedback and kind of how this model works. And so the first part, this concept that feedback starts before intake, we're saying that we are on a discovery mission with this child, and we're going to integrate this throughout the assessment process. So while we're going to be talking about how to define a diagnosis today, this isn't the place that we start. We've been building this from the beginning. We've been building a shared language. We're discovering this together with the child. So when we arrive at this point of defining the diagnosis, we've already been walking this route together and we know what it's all about. Because we don't want any surprises. Because all a diagnosis is here's what we've learned. Here's what we've discovered. Let's kind of review it and put it together in a package that has that we can put together in a way that's easy to turn around and say, hey teacher, guess what I learned? Hey mom, guess what I learned? Hey friends, guess what I learned? And so that we can set the child up for ongoing conversation with the caregivers and the people who love and support them in their life. So that's really what we're aiming for with this diagnosis. So it's not coming out of the blue, and we're putting it together so it can be a really helpful tool for helping a child continue to understand themselves as they go on. And whenever I'm thinking about talking to a kid about their diagnosis, I am starting from a place of knowing that neurodivergence is a superpower. These things that we're talking to kids about, they are not something that's separate from their strengths. This is their brain. This is how they're put together. These are the amazing things that they have to bring to the world. And understanding that the way that your brain is different makes some things pretty challenging because the world is not always built for you. But some things are actually easier. And it also, this way your brain was built gives you this skill set and these special, amazing, beautiful things that you are bringing to the world. So when we diagnose, by definition, we're looking for the difficulties. When we're determining eligibility for a child, we are looking at the difficulties. This is the foundation of our diagnosis. But that is not the whole story. And before we talk to the child, we really have to shift our lens. In fact, before we talk to parents, this lens shift is important too. Our biggest change makers in history were divergent from the norm by definition. And that is a really important thing to be able to communicate to kids. Being different is really important. In fact, this concept of normal is a statistical fiction. Like, there is nothing we can point to say this is a normal person. These are averages that nobody actually falls right on. And there's a certain amount of variation from the theme that is kind of within the comfort zone of the world. This is kind of how the world was designed. And then there's those of us who are truly divergent from that sphere. But these are the people who put the world, who drive the world forward, who bring new ideas, who think differently, who are not thinking the way that most people are. And so this is how change happens. And your strengths and your superpowers are the benefit of this divergent mind. They're not in spite of it. And so a lot of times we start with the child's strengths, and then we say, okay, you have all those great strengths, and then here are the things that are difficult. But when I think about presenting a diagnosis to the child, I'm actually specifically thinking about how do we bring these things together to show how these things that we've learned about your brain are making some situations and some things a little harder to navigate, and also making some things a lot easier, because it's the same brain and your strengths are the benefit of the way your brain is different. And then finally, our goal in supporting you and designing interventions is not to help you be more normal. The goal is to help you be more you. So how do we understand you and support you in a way that's going to allow you to be your full, amazing, beautiful, incredible self? Not to make you more closer to this statistical fiction that we have. Another thing that I think about is what to share. This is a question that I get a lot. We learn so much about kids. It's overwhelming for adults. It's overwhelming for the school team. It's overwhelming for other professionals. It's overwhelming for us a lot of the time. So what in the world do we share with kids? So here are just a couple of things that I think about. So related to what I just said, I'm sharing the strengths, and I'm thinking about the specific strengths that are really related to the benefits of having this kind of brain. And I'm narrowing in on those because kids often have a lot of strengths, but I'm really trying to help the child understand a concept. And I've seen kids get really overwhelmed by their list of strengths. So we might have made during our session, a list of 10 strengths, but really honing in on a couple that are really helping them to shine and are related to kind of the way their brain works is helpful for the feedback session, because it's not too much information. And when I'm sharing the challenges, again, there might be a lot of things that are difficult, but I'm gonna try and narrow in on just a few. And some of the things I'm thinking about are, what information do I have that's going to answer the questions that they have? So I go back to their questions, and that's going to tell me what they're ready to hear and is going to tell me what's the most important to share. So if we're seeing that they have a number of social challenges and that there are difficulties with reading facial expressions and understanding nuance, but this child has a group of friends that they get along well with, and friendship isn't an issue, that's probably not the place that I'm going to start if I'm going to address that at all with them, because they might have other questions that are actually really much more pressing that I do want to really focus on and answer. I also think about what interventions they'll be getting and why we want them to do those things. So anytime there's going to be a new class, a new person they're working with, something that's shifting, they're going to be starting something new, a social skills class, or working with an occupational therapist, or there's going to be a resource specialist coming into the class and working with them, or they're going to be going to a new class. I want to make sure that they understand why these things are happening and that they have a framework for that. So how do I pick the things that are going to help them to understand why this new thing is about to be happening? And then when there are complex diagnoses, multiple diagnoses, no diagnoses, because we can't really hone in on it yet, I'm thinking about, again, the starting point for treatment. So whatever we've determined is the most important place to start treatment, I want to make sure that I'm picking out that skill or that diagnosis that's going to help me explain why that's where we're starting. I'm also thinking about, is there a skill or a process that connects all of these things? So last week I talked about a child who had some learning challenges and some kind of budding mental health challenges. We weren't really sure where they were going. But one of the things, oh, and some social challenges that he was also identifying. And the diagnosis profile was pretty complex, but there was this skill that really connected everything, and that was processing speed, that he really needed time to process. And that helped him understand why the social piece was hard, why the classroom piece and kind of being called on could be hard, and why he might get very anxious and feel really down on himself when things were really hard. So picking that one kind of connected everything. And of course, I'm thinking about what's most connected to the child's concern. So I don't have to tell them everything about their whole profile now. I'm going to choose the piece that's most important to the next step. Now, because we're thinking about this diagnosis as part of a whole feedback model and a whole process, we already have the building blocks of making this diagnosis. So throughout the assessment with the child, you've been talking to them about their highways and their construction zones and documenting what you find in their words. And so the building blocks are there, and now what I want to do is highlight 3 to 5 highways. Again, trying to use those the child's words so that it's part of their memory of what we worked on together. I'm going to highlight 1 to 3 construction zones, again, using the child's words. And you'll notice that there's fewer of these than the highways. I'm still not overwhelming them, but I want to make sure that this list is visually balanced. And we're bringing this together and making a connection so we can show a pattern. Because the reason we have diagnoses is because there are these patterns that we see that tend to respond well to certain interventions. And so it is what we're looking for. We're looking for that pattern. And now we're kind of cluing the kid into, this is the pattern that I saw with you, and that's why we're getting to this conclusion. And you're not alone is a big piece. Let's celebrate this, that we found this out, and kind of realize that it's not just you. This happens to a lot of people. If you're using the brain building book, you have already documented this with the child. It's already down. So these are the pages that you're going back and looking at. You have your highways all written down with the child, and you have your construction zones, or the things that are hard that they're working on, written down. And the page that you're getting to is this page here that has this language baked in. So lots of people's brains have highways and construction zones that are very similar to yours. So many, in fact, that there are special words to describe what's going on. And again, this might be the diagnosis, or it might be another special word that kind of connects those things. But we have already put the building blocks in place with the child, and now we're going to kind of bring them together. I've been introducing some sentence frames to really help you put these things together, and trying to kind of evolve them to really give you as much flexibility as possible. So the standard one that's usually in my brain as a starting point is that this diagnosis means your brain is built in a way that makes highways come easily and construction zones more challenging. So insert here. It makes ideas and creativity come easily, but writing those things down much more challenging. But sometimes that framing doesn't always work. And so other ones I find myself using a lot. My brain works best when, and that's some version of I can use my highways, when I have time to process information, when I can write things down, when I can put my hands on things. It can be harder when I have to keep all the steps in my head. whatever their construction zone is. And then we can use one of our more general terms. It doesn't have to be a diagnosis. So this is called needing processing time. This is called difficulty with executive functioning. This is called difficulty with working memory. And it can be diagnosis free if there's a reason to not present that right now. So let's dive in to building a child-friendly diagnosis of ADHD. Now, the first piece of presenting the diagnosis is really looking at the two sides. So this is what is amazing and beautiful about this child's brain. And this is a great graphic, and it comes from Danny Donovan, who's made a ton of these. And I think, Leanne, I have that link for you to put in the chat. And I love bringing these out at feedback sessions because there's always one that really speaks to the child's experience. But this one really demonstrates where we're going in terms of thinking about the benefits of having this kind of brain. So to diagnose ADHD, we're talking about inattentiveness, hyperactivity, impulsivity, or some combination, or some area or combination of these. And we can see the difficulties that these things bring about, but we can also take these same terms and look at the strengths that they bring. So our inattentive kids are dreamers, and their dreams go to amazing places. They make connections that we've never seen before, and they are coming up with ideas that are so novel and wouldn't occur to somebody who didn't have that power to just let their thoughts go. Our impulsive kids are risk takers. And actually, research shows that people with a certain profile of ADHD are more likely to be successful entrepreneurs. That you need that impulsivity, that risk taker piece. That you need that energy, you need the hyper focus to really be able to pursue a dream like that to that extent, and to go outside the norm, to do something totally different. You need a different kind of brain. So reframing these things is really helpful for the child to understand their diagnosis, because they're going to hear a lot of negative stuff out in the world. So we have this opportunity to give them both sides from the get-go. And there is some really cool research from a guy named Johan Wilkund in Syracuse, and I will include that link on my website to some of his research. So I don't have it right now, but he has done some really cool work looking at, from a research perspective, this connection between ADHD and entrepreneurship specifically. And he is an educator with ADHD, and so he talks brilliantly about these beautiful and amazing things that come with this kind of brain. So some of the common ADHD highways that I see, and this is offering you guys some language that can be helpful for thinking about kid-friendly ways to say these things, and to listen for what you might hear with your own students or clients. So coming up with creative ideas for writing or storytelling, remembering stories and especially experiences, doing better as things get harder. I love seeing this profile that the early ones, kids tend to bomb, and then it gets harder, and all of a sudden you see like the whole change in their demeanor. Making people laugh, taking in a ton of information at once, processing information really quickly, jumping into new experiences, and of course, the hyperfocus. Some of the things that are commonly construction zones might be waiting to share those awesome ideas, writing down those awesome ideas, staying focused when things are boring or easy, getting started on your work, keeping track of all of the steps in something, catching your errors when you're processing things really quickly, keeping things organized, or moving and fidgeting without disrupting others. And I want to point out something about the wording here. In a lot of these, the superpower is implied. So waiting to share your awesome ideas really frames this as you have awesome ideas. We just have to find the right place to share them. Staying focused on boring or easy things implies that these things are easy for you. Like it reinforces that you're extremely capable. It's just putting your focus on the things that are easy. That's actually not interesting to your brain. You want the challenge. And moving or fidgeting without disrupting others. The moving and fidgeting isn't the challenge. Your brain needs to move. You need that fidgeting to really stay focused. But we need to work on it not being something that disrupts others, because that is hard for everybody to learn. So how do we make sure we preserve this piece that makes you be able to be the most you, but make sure that we're doing it within the classroom in a way that makes sense. So then we can bring these things together. And as I said, when I'm looking at which highways and which construction zones to really hone in on, I am thinking about the ones that are connected to show those two sides of a coin. So for you, ADHD means your brain is noticing a lot of things at once, but it may be tricky to focus in on the one thing your teacher is asking. For you, your brain is built in a way that makes memory and creativity easy, but writing those things or waiting your turn to share those things hard. Your brain enjoys things that are new and exciting, but it may be harder to learn things that you have to repeat a lot, like math facts. And doing a definition like this is a great way to integrate some of those other challenges if we don't want to overwhelm the child with multiple diagnoses. So for a child who is ADHD and has a learning disability, connecting in the learning piece with ADHD helps them see how this kind of brain can make certain situations with learning challenging without having to introduce, oh, and by the way, you have dyscalculia and dyslexia and dysgraphia and this, right? We can look at the way that the characteristics of ADHD can have an impact in different types of learning scenarios. ADHD means your brain loves moving and exploring and may have a harder time when learning happens in one place. And your brain may have an easy time remembering stories and experiences, but may have a harder time remembering all the steps to a math problem or a science experiment. So again, working in that learning piece so that we don't have to bombard a child with multiple diagnoses, but we can still help them understand why math might be so hard, especially if that's one of their questions, right? So the next piece is to let the child know that they are not alone and that we can celebrate them having this really cool, awesome brain. And who better to celebrate with than Jessica McCabe? I hope I'm saying her name right. She runs a channel called How to ADHD. The YouTube channel, and she has a website that I think is constantly evolving. And she has a number of videos that are amazing, but this is the one that I show most often at feedback sessions to really celebrate the ADHD brain. We won't watch the whole thing, but I want to give you guys a taste of it.
Hello, brains! I've always loved having ADHD. My favorite aunt had it too, so when I was diagnosed as a kid, it was like getting to join this cool club. But after a year of research, I've discovered it's responsible for a lot of challenges that I didn't realize. I still love my ADHD brain, but some days when I'm sleep deprived, when my symptoms are worse than usual, and I'm buried under piles of research talking about the potential negative consequences of having ADHD, I have to wonder, would I rather not have it? It's easy to fall into that kind of thinking when you're focused more on what you've done wrong than what you've done right. But as somebody told me recently, ADHD is not a failed version of normal. Our brains just work differently, and with those differences come a lot of strengths. So yeah, even on my worst days, I'm glad I have ADHD. And here's why. Here are my 10 favorite things about being a brain. Number 10, we are enthusiastic. Does this mean we might talk over you sometimes? Absolutely. But it also means we give the biggest hugs, get excited about the smallest successes, and you'll never have to worry about awkward silence. Number 9, we're willing to take risks. Yes, this can mean we burn ourselves with steamers sometimes, but it also means we jump headfirst into challenges and opportunities when others would rather play it safe. According to my research, ADHDers are 300% more likely to take the risk of starting their own business, and sometimes those risks pay off. Number 8, we're resilient. Failing a million times means coming out stronger. Things not going according to plan is just another day at the office. So when everybody else is freaking out, we are working on solutions. Number 7, we are funny. Failing a million times also means developing a sense of humor. You can't walk into walls, pull your keys out of the freezer, or show up 15 minutes late to work on your day off. Again, without learning to laugh about it. That sense of humor not only helps us get through our challenges, but makes life fun for everyone else around us. Number 6, we're generous. I've never met an
All right. So hopefully that link will end up in the chat so that you guys can watch the rest of it. But this is a fun way to celebrate the amazingness of having a divergent.
Whoops, I've always loved having ADHD.
In this way.
My favorite aunt had.
If I can figure out how to get past this. Fantastic. Here we go. So the next really common diagnosis that I'm often talking to kids about is dyslexia. So dyslexia, again, we want to think about this as two sides of a coin. So we're diagnosing it based on a specific set of challenges, but when we step back and think about the dyslexic brain, we're going to think about the benefits of having this different kind of brain. And so this is from Genius Within, and it's just one of many graphics that kind of calls out the strengths that are super common in kids and individuals with dyslexia, as well as the challenges that create this profile. But the general sense is that there are specific challenges related to reading, but also this pattern of strengths that is related to the big picture items, like understanding the big themes from what they might hear, or in making connections between different concepts, and also between people. An interpersonal interconnectedness. It's really common with individuals who have this type of wiring. So some of the common dyslexic highways that I've seen with my kids: memory for oral information can be really strong, making connections, conceptual connections, as well as interpersonal connections. Auditory comprehension is often so much higher than reading comprehension. Taking things apart, putting them back together, puzzles, as I said, interpersonal connections, imagination and creativity, and just being a divergent brain, seeing things in a really different way. Storytelling, visualization skills are often really strong with the kids that I work with. And that ability to call up an image, problem-solving skills, resiliency. And this is true for a lot of our kids who have these different kinds of brains, that for either because it's an innate character, part of their personality and what they're coming into this world with, or because they've had to build it over time. This is a huge superpower that comes out. And of course, the construction zones. And again, we're going to look at kind of how we're putting this in language that kids can understand. So hearing sounds, recognizing symbols or little details. And I love this one because often kids do really well on the more big picture kinds of things. And then we can talk about big picture versus the little details and symbols that are less meaningful in themselves. Keeping lots of steps in mind at once can be really hard. And this construction zone can also help to explain why writing, and math can be hard when you're dyslexic without having to add on multiple diagnoses. Processing information quickly or automatically. So a lot of times kids are able to process information, but doing it automatically is hard. Remembering spelling patterns, and attention or fatigue. And this one's often important, again, for making sure we're not overwhelming kids with multiple diagnoses, or being able to explain that a lot of times when your brain is working this hard, it's going to be hard to pay attention because you're tired. And there might be other, even additional attention issues that are coming up, but we can connect it back to how hard your brain is working, and that it might be really difficult to attend to these specific things in school. And so this is how this diagnosis might come together. So your brain is built in a way that makes it easy to see visual patterns like math, puzzles, or Legos, but it's harder to see letter patterns for reading and spelling. So we're connecting these things together. It's not broken, it's just it's hard to apply it here, and we'll find a different way. Your brain is not learning to read by the most common road. It also means your brain's getting a lot of practice coming up with different ways to get there, which is giving you these amazing creative thinking powers. Your brain is having a hard time keeping all the sounds in your mind when you're trying to sound out a word, which can be tiring. But once you know all the words, your brain has an easy time understanding the story. And again, once we've explained a diagnosis to a kid, taking a moment to celebrate the superpowers and let them know that they're not alone. And this is a clip from a much longer video made by Dyslexia, which again is a great resource for a ton of little videos of kids and actors and business moguls and chefs and all of these different people who identify as being dyslexic, who can talk about some of the challenges in school and about how their dyslexic mind is responsible for where they are today.
It's like a superpower in a way, because you can see things that other people can't. You see the bigger picture.
I'm better at hockey because I know where to stand in the pitch because I can understand the game better.
I really like making my own stories.
I love storytelling and I love communication.
I was always very good at creative writing.
I always make my own songs up in my head.
Actually, I'm a rapper, so then I express myself while rapping.
I would quite like to be a pop star.
I'm so lucky because I always knew I wanted to be an actor, and I get to do this for a living.
As a child, I dreamt of being a scientist.
One of my strengths is maths. I like building little robots and lots of different things.
Just remember that you're different and it's a good thing.
All right. Nice. Okay, here we go. So let's move on to autism. So autism for me is such an important concept to be able to reframe both for parents as well as for children, to really get the full understanding of what it means to be an autistic mind. And we are still learning so much about autism, in part because in the last few years, the voices of autistic individuals are coming into the conversation. For so long, the research and the conversation on autism was happening about autistic individuals, and now we're hearing a lot more from autistic individuals themselves, seeing more autistic individuals involved in the research and the support for our young people. And so hearing this voice is so important to helping kids to understand their minds. And I really love this DSM reframing by Matt Lowry. He is a psychologist who is autistic, and he is the father of an autistic child as well. And so these are the DSM criteria that that we're familiar with. So abnormal social approach, deficits in nonverbal communication, insistence on sameness, and so forth. And as a sampling, and the full version of this is available on my website on the Autism blog, but here are a couple key points. So instead of abnormal social approach, Matt describes it as a tendency to talk passionately about certain topics and not be so interested in engaging in small talk. Instead of deficits in nonverbal communication, we have differences in nonverbal communication, including stimming or looking elsewhere while talking, which can actually be really helpful for staying more engaged and focused. Instead of deficits in understanding and maintaining relationships, we can think of this as, due to these differences, autistics tend to be shunned by neurotypicals. And it's really hard to create a relationship by somebody who is not engaging with you or is expecting you to be more like them in order to engage. Insistence on sameness or inflexible adherence to routines can be thought of as finding security in routines, as a really healthy way to cope with the fact that when you don't have a sensory filter, the world is in a pretty chaotic state a lot of the time. And of course, highly restricted fixated interests also become the passions that individuals are able to pursue at such a deep level and become the things that change the world. And instead of symptoms causing clinically significant impairment, Matt says these traits tend to cause distress in other people. This is another reframe that I find really, really helpful in explaining autism to kids and parents. That instead of thinking of a spectrum that is a linear spectrum, we can think of a kind of circular, multi-dimensional kind of spectrum. And thinking about different areas of processing or functioning that may be more or less different from this imaginary normal point. And some of the differences actually can be really useful in everyday life and bring about these strengths, like heightened perception. But some of these things can cause difficulties, hence there being a diagnosis. But when you have heightened perception but don't have a strong sensory filter, then it can make things really, really hard. So in thinking about autistic highways, some of the strengths that I see really commonly include deep and passionate interests, being very knowledgeable, being truthful and trustworthy, thriving with routines and consistency, having the ability to hyperfocus, feeling things very deeply, enjoying movement or other sensory experiences, noticing sounds, sights, textures, tastes, or sensations that others may not. I had a child walk in recently who was like, "Ooh, smells like a psychologist's office." And apparently there's something about us that all smells the same. Using movement or rhythm to help stay calm in stressful times, which is a skill that many others may not have or may not have found. And then finding unique ways of communicating. So, of course, autistic construction zones are a lot of things that can be really challenging. But again, I want you to take a look at the way that I've framed some of these things because the language is really intentional. So finding friends I can connect with can be really challenging. Instead of thinking about this as social skills, thinking about how do I find people that I can connect with? Because if my way of looking at the world is very different, it might be actually really hard to find my peers. The definition of peers being equals or people who are similar to you. So instead of thinking about how do I get the social skills to be able to fit in with this group, how do we help this child find the people that they really can authentically connect with? Writing down my big ideas, because writing is often a challenge. Knowing what to do when things change or are unpredictable. Navigating the crazy hallways during passing period. So getting that kid language in there is those specific, really concrete experiences. Knowing if my peers are joking or not. This also came from a child that having friends wasn't a problem. It's just the problem was that there was these experiences that kept happening that were just really uncomfortable because he didn't know if kids were joking or not. And that was the problem, not reading social communication. This was his problem that's very specific to a specific type of incident that was really uncomfortable for him. Focusing on things I'm not interested in, letting a teacher know when I need a break. And you'll notice, again, that things that are not in here are things that may be more kind of neurotypical expectations that we don't need to help an autistic child be more normal. Our job is to figure out what their superpowers are and how they connect with the world, how they perceive the world, so we can help them be more them. So I'm not going to read all of these because I have included a lot here, but these are some of the ways that I've put together this definition for the kids that I've worked with. So your brain is built in a way that notices many sights, sounds, smells, and textures that others may not. And sometimes this can get overwhelming, and you may need some tools to filter out the sensations that you don't want. Or you have a superpower for focusing on the things that you love. It may also be challenging to find others who love these things as much as you do, but we're going to figure that out. You process information in unique and creative ways, though it may be difficult to understand how non-autistic people are seeing the world. Or autism means your brain is wired to focus with an uncommon intensity, though it may be hard to get stuff done that you're not so interested in. So, and again, I would love to introduce you to this video, and I'll just give you kind of a sampling of it, but this is from Asan, and is another amazing differential for really explaining the differences and celebrating the amazingness of being a person with a different brain.
Welcome to the autistic community. Before we talk about living with autism, you may be wondering, what exactly is autism? Everyone's brain is different, and the way your brain works is called autism. It's not a sickness or something that needs to be cured. It's the way you see the world, and it will always be a part of you. Many autistic people process senses differently. Things like a bright light or a disgusting smell overstimulate the senses. It's common for autistic people to stim. Stimming is doing something repetitively with your body because it feels good, is calming, or makes it easier to focus on other things. For some autistics, it's hard to hear or say words. Autistic people who can't talk are nonverbal, and they use other ways of communicating, like pointing, pictures, or iPads. Even autistic thinking is different. We can channel our focus very intensely, especially on things we like and don't like. We can also find it hard to process change. Using the term autism can help non-autistic people better understand how you are different.
Whoops.
Some may want to go to college, have a job, or live on their own. Just does not mean that we are abnormal. We are just another kind of normal. Being autistic affects how we experience everything. We learn, see, and have feelings in ways that most people do not. This is good, because people with different ways of thinking can work together to make positive changes in the world. You're not the only autistic person. Lots of people are autistic. Some may not be diagnosed yet. Others may choose to keep it to themselves. It might seem like you're the only one right now, but at least 1 in every 68 people are autistic.
All right. So hopefully that has been helpful for gaining some language around thinking about these really common diagnoses. And I thought we could try something to see if we can try this out on for ourselves, to brainstorm some of this language when looking at another really common diagnosis, which is anxiety related disorders. So what I would like you to do is to think for yourself about some of the highways that you typically see with the clients, the kids that you work with who have an anxious profile, who have anxiety is one of the things that is bringing them in to see you. And what are some of the common highways that you see? And when you come up with yours, what I'd like you to do is actually put it into the chat, but don't press enter yet. And when I say go, everybody is going to press enter at the same time. So put your highway into the chat. What is beautiful and amazing about the anxious brain? Hopefully we have 90, well, somebody left. We have 92 people here, so hopefully we get a lot of responses. Everybody have your response in there. On your mark, get set, click enter, go. Wow! Thoughtful, observant, planning, conscientious, foresight, sympathetic, caring. I saw caring and caring and caring. Meticulous, having high expectations, thoughtful, conscientious. Yes, 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 yes. Careful. Not being too, not jumping into things before you really know. Prepared, I love it. Compassionate about others. Yes, compassion, being tapped into other people, being prepared. And we know that anxious minds, they reach their flow when other people are having a hard time. So these are the kids that are there for their friends in a big way. Picking up on details, their brains are very attentive to little tiny things. Awesome. All right, now let's think about some of the construction zones. So again, take a couple of seconds just to think about what are the things that are often challenging for your kids that you see with anxiety. And think about some of that kid-friendly language. The things that they might say are challenging. Don't press enter yet. And go, press enter. Right, getting stuck, worrying about things, getting overwhelmed. It takes a long time to do things. Noticing too many details. Distracted, overloaded easily. Yeah, so now we start to see the connection. These are kids who often are extremely attentive to their environment. They have very high expectations and are really striving to get things right. They notice a lot, but they can become overloaded easily. They might react to things that are not emergencies. Even though they're really good at reacting to emergencies, they might be reacting as if there's an emergency when there isn't. And because they're so attentive to those details, they might be worried about making mistakes and finding them. Thinking traps, thinking that there's the worst. So now you can start to put this together for yourself. So anxiety means your brain is built in a way that for example, takes in a ton of information, notices a lot of details, but can become overwhelmed very easily. Your brain is built in a way that is ready for action, but sometimes it can respond as if there's an emergency when there isn't. So if anybody has any other ideas of how they might put those things together, you don't have to chat storm these ones. You can just put them in the chat if you have any other ideas of how you might put these things together for a kid that you've worked with or for a child. Or do it for yourself. Maybe we should have chat stormed that one. So hopefully you guys have some ideas. If you think of one, I'll be just keeping an eye on the chat to see. There we go. Awesome. Thank you. So means your brain is trying a bit too hard sometimes to protect you. Yeah. Your brain is doing an awesome time protecting you when it needs to, but sometimes it might be trying too hard. That is a great example. Thank you. So more terms. So a lot of times people ask me, what do you do if the child has a lot of diagnoses, if we don't want to share the diagnosis with the child, if we don't have one to share with the child, if parents don't want to share the diagnosis with the child? I am often talking to parents about the benefits of helping kids name what's going on. Because once we name it, we can reframe it. Name it to reframe it. So once we name it, we can really take that opportunity to help them understand things from a different perspective and see both sides. And as I talked about in the first workshop, kids already have their own definition of what's going on, their own explanation. And often it is not a helpful one. So we want to really put ourselves in the position to reframe and redefine how we think about how this child thinks about their brain. And as you saw in those videos, there are just such welcoming, huge communities that are so excited to welcome your child in, and people who have walked this path before. And it really helps to know that you're not alone. At the same time, there are often times when it's not the right time. And at the end of the day, I'm always checking in with parents to see if this feels right, because I'm counting on parents to be able to bring this conversation forward, and I want them to feel really confident too about the language that we're sharing. So for whatever reason, if it's not the right time to share the diagnosis, these are some other terms that I find really helpful, and often are linking a lot of the challenges that kids are facing. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a case study to show you kind of what this looked like in an actual case, complete with all the things that come with writing in the moment. But I can talk you through what we did here. This is a middle schooler who was struggling with motivation, and that was the referral question. Family history of learning challenges and ADHD. Parents and others recognize significant depressive symptoms, including me, but the child recognizes low motivation and missing friends, but not depression. In fact, when I introduced the word depression during our sessions, she said no, and in filling out the BASC, didn't endorse anything related. And the diagnosis was pretty complex. There's definitely learning differences, not so definite ADHD, though highly suspected. Typo. And definite depression, though she didn't see it that way. So how do we talk to her? Well, I'll show you how this kind of evolved. And I'll let you know the pages that you'll see there these are the pages from the adolescent version of the brain building book, which will be coming out, I'm hoping, early 2022. I am testing it right now with the kids that I'm working with. And so this is what's so that we know kind of what to change and before we put it out there to the world. But looks really similar. Here's a picture of the brain. We spent some time talking about different pieces and even talking about dopamine and talking about dopamine and motivation and kind of how these chemicals are released in your brain, and how the last year and a half it has been kind of a dopamine dead zone for most of us. And we talked about her emotional system as the is everything okay system. And if it's not okay, it can make it really hard to think. And we talked about how the last year and a half, everything has not been okay. And so as somebody who's very sensitive to the world and really tapped in to her friends' emotions, her own emotions, her parents' emotions, her emotional brain is picking up on the fact that not everything is okay. And that's going to really affect motivation. We talked about her highways. These were kind of accumulated throughout the testing session. So good at stuff with words, works best when she has time to process. Her brain likes to challenge. She definitely showed that pattern of easy, the quote unquote, the early items she would make mistakes on, but then her brain would turn on as things got more challenging. And friendships and relationships are super, super important to her. And this was a kid that, when I asked her about friends and if, kind of what those are like, she came up, there was one story that came out that a friend was having difficulty and she was the only one who noticed that this friend was struggling. And she described how she was able to go and intervene and really change the friend's perspective and really help that friend out of a crisis. So we talked about how amazing that is. And she's like, yeah, people usually come to me to talk to me about problems. Okay. Math facts are hard for her. Organization, turning on attention for boring things, and motivation. So these were some of the construction areas that we called out. And then later at the feedback session, we connected these things as executive functioning so that we could really use that term. Some of her questions, she had questions about math. She had questions about organization because she was losing track of assignments. And she had questions about her motivation. And we talked about this a lot. These light blue things are things that we filled in the feedback session of kind of what is going to be helpful for her. But the reason I wanted to focus in on motivation is because this depression piece was not something she was connecting with, but it was going to be the place where we started treatment, because this was a big factor, kind of a cloud that was overlaying everything. And so it was really important to find a way to talk to her about depression, because that's the intervention she was going to be getting. Otherwise, her parents were concerned she wasn't going to go. And I was kind of concerned that if she didn't know why she was going, she definitely wasn't going to engage, especially since she didn't see herself as having a challenge in this way. But what we know about depression is that it often looks like low motivation and slowed processing speed. And so making this connection and talking about that she really does feel disconnected from friends, and she is a person who really thrives on her friendship connections. And this is one of the things that is her superpower that she hasn't been able to use in a year and a half. She really thrives with in-person interaction, and learning online has no in-person interaction. So of course her motivation is low. And everything going on in the world. And she was really tapped in not only to COVID, but here in California, we've been having some pretty crazy fires. There's political things. And she is so tapped into all of these things, and they're weighing on her. So when we actually went for the diagnosis, these three concepts came up as really important. And at first we started with just the processing time. So looking at needing more time to get organized and to make sense of what she's learning, that we were going to get her additional time at school. And so connecting that back. I showed you how we made that connection for executive functioning. And here I'm planting the seeds because I suspect that we're going to end up with an ADHD diagnosis down the road. But with the cloud of depression and not having a lot of good data from the last year and a half, I didn't feel like it was right to give that diagnosis at this time, because her challenges might not be at that level, but definitely something she needed to work on. And we can use this term, executive functioning, to work on that. And then we had to introduce depression. And thinking about what's beautiful and amazing, putting that emphasis on being tapped in and empathetic to the hard things in the world, the things that are going on with your friends, that your brain is particularly perceptive of these things. And then it's not always about being sad, but can look like low motivation and not having a lot to be excited about. And she agreed that she was connecting with all of these things and that she really wanted to feel more connected and find that motivation. And so framing it in this way helped her to be able to see why working with a therapist was going to be really important. So here's an example of taking something and kind of putting it into a context that's really going to help move a child forward and give the family a vocabulary to talk about something that's been on all of their mind in a big way. But now we can talk about it as motivation, getting excited about things. Thank you for viewing this webinar. I hope the resources and tools we covered are helpful to you. Please let me know if there are any questions. And just a reminder, if the Brain Building book is a tool that could be helpful to you and the families that you work with, there is a 10% off coupon code that's available through the end of September. Thank you for all of the amazing work that you do with children and their families, and I really look forward to continuing this conversation about how to talk to kids about their amazing brains.